This is the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Got a cool article in Comment magazine, comment.org. It's kind of a journal of faith and public life. And James Mumford wrote an article. I don't know if he's part of the band Mumford and Sons. I don't think so. But James Mumford, he wrote an essay called Find Brutal Friends. Find Brutal Friends. Is friendship about affirmation and non-judgmentalism or challenge and truth-telling? It's a very good question. And he starts off by saying that few endeavors in life are as risky as true friendship. If you give your friend the brutal honesty that you think they need, the brutal honesty that you owe them, and you inevitably run the risk of rejection. But in the end, and this is a great line, he says, in the end, only people prepared to lose friends will prove to be good friends. You've got to be willing to lose the friendship in order to tell somebody the truth. That's a tough thing. That's a tough thing to swallow sometimes. And then he gives us an illustration, the movie Emma. Jane Austen, of course, wrote the novel in 1815. And James Mumford kind of uses this as an example of telling your friend the truth that they need to hear. There's this scene in the book, and I think it's in the movie too, where Emma, who's kind of, self-centered, she organizes this sort of game for some of her friends. And one of her friends is the spinster known as Miss Bates. If you've read the book, you probably know this. She's kind of impoverished. She's not doing well financially. She's not married. She's a spinster. And according to this game that Emma sets up, everybody playing the game has to say either one thing that's very clever, and you could recite a poem or a line from a book, or two things that are moderately clever, or three things that are very dull indeed. And so Miss Bates, who's kind of insecure, she is intimidated a little bit, and she says, I'm going to choose option number 3. I'm going to say three things very dull indeed. And then Emma could not resist, according to Jane Austen, saying to Miss Bates, ma'am, but there might be a difficulty. Pardon me, but you will be limited as to the number, only 3 at once. You can only say 3 dull things at once, okay? Because, usually you say more. And so Miss Bates is obviously really hurt. She's stung by this. And according to Jane Austen, she writes, Miss Bates, deceived by the mock ceremony of her manner, did not immediately catch Emma's meaning, but when it burst on her, it could not anger. So she didn't lash out in anger. She wasn't upset, though a slight blush showed that it could pain her. Well, to be sure. Yes, I see what she means. And then she turns to Mr. Knightley, and Mr. Knightley's a mutual friend. She turns to Mr. Knightley and says, I will try to hold my tongue. I must make myself very disagreeable, or else she would not have said such a thing to an old friend. Wow, in other words, I must really tick her off. Why would she say something like that to me? It must be my fault. And your heart just breaks for this character, Miss Bates. But according to the book, what happens next is that as Emma is waiting to get into her carriage, this is back in the days of horse and carriage, of course, Mr. Knightley catches up to her, and he makes sure that nobody else is around to hear this conversation, which is kind of good, because basically what he's going to do is he's going to give her a correction. He's going to give her a correction. And what he said was, how could you be so unfeeling to Miss Bates? And he says, I didn't think it was possible that you could be so insolent, Emma, in your wit to a woman of her character, her age, and her situation. It was badly done, he says to her. It was badly done. And my wife, who's a big, she loves literature, she wanted to make sure that I got the exact quote. So she actually texted me a picture of the page from the book. And so I could give another quote from Mr. Knightley here. Here's what he says to Emma also. He says, look, he's correcting her. You shouldn't have done this. And he says, this is not pleasant to you, Emma, and it is very far from pleasant to me, but I will tell you truths while I can, satisfied with proving myself your friend by very faithful counsel, and trusting that you will sometime or other do me greater justice than you can do now. So, hey, I must tell you the truth. I have to do it. That's how I'm going to prove myself to be your friend, by faithful counsel. Now, you might not listen to me right now. It's like Hans and Franz, hear me now, listen to me later, believe me sometime next week, but hopefully the advice will sink in. And so he was really, in the book, a very good friend to Emma. And she realizes that she's made a terrible mistake. She just feels awful afterwards. And so that's what a true friend does. But in our culture, and this is what Mumford explains, talks about the triumph of the therapeutic. The triumph of the therapeutic. And this is often what passes for friendship in what he calls our therapeutic culture. So if a true friend makes the good of another person their own, our culture often takes it in a different way. They sort of take it to mean help your friend pursue his or her own good. In other words, whatever they think is good. I'm only a true friend if I help them do what they've already predetermined they should do. So there are all kinds of self-help writers out there who say, hey, the best friends are people that help you achieve your goals. Well, what happens if you're climbing the ladder, but the ladder is leaning up against the wrong wall? And so we've got to be more than that. We've got to be more than that. But this attitude is pervasive in the culture. In fact, he quotes Psychology Today magazine. Psychology Today lists non-judgmentalism as a key quality of a real friend. The ability to be non-judgmental with respect to a friend's choices, regardless of how they differ from our own. Because a true friend would never impose her own agenda. Got to be tolerant, got to be empowering. That's what people think. And so they think if I were to disagree with my friend, if I were to say, oh, maybe you shouldn't do this, that's being paternalistic. No, you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. Well, this is part of the therapeutic culture. So it's kind of this idea that there are no objective standards that we should all be kind of trying to measure up to. Everything is subjective, relativism reigns, there is no truth. I'm just supposed to affirm you in whatever you've decided is good. Whether or not that conflicts with the actual good, whether there are true values out there that cohere with reality. So that's a problem. That's a problem. And Mumford says, what do you do if one of your friends has defective desires? They desire things, but they're defective. And he talks about his own experience. He says, look, in the past, I was a workaholic. He says he was addicted to work. He says he was obsessed with work. And he spent all his energy, time, and money on his work. And now he looks back on it and says, man, I was totally dysfunctional. But back then, I never took a day off. I never even took a holiday. I even worked on Christmas Day. And I made all kinds of rationalizations and excuses. The cause is worthy, the sacrosanct calling, But he said, no, this was actually an addiction to work, and it was detrimental to my overall purpose and well-being. It was bad for my family. I neglected my children. It was bad for me. I was not living a balanced life. And so that's the problem, because sometimes our friends want things that are bad for themselves. And they might not know that, but we can see that from outside. We can kind of see if somebody's struggling with certain things like workaholism or some sort of an addiction. And that's a problem. There's also defective desires of other kinds as well. In the novel The Great Gatsby, and this is something Mumford brings up. Maybe you've seen the movie with Robert Redford, The Great Gatsby. So in the book by F. Scott Fitzgerald, Jay Gatsby has this dream. He sets his heart on this one thing. I'm going to have to read the novel. I don't want to spoil it for you. But Fitzgerald says he paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. Paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. Well, what happens if your friend has a dream and they're just pursuing it at all costs? And you think, maybe this isn't healthy. Maybe this isn't good. So what do? We might be accused of being paternalistic if we say, this isn't good. This isn't good. You're not fully informed here. And so this is something that we need to think about as we're trying to help our friends. So he talks a little bit about the history of philosophy, and you might have read this yourself, Plato's Symposium, and Plato talks about Socrates. Now, Socrates goes to this big party, and everybody at the party is supposed to give a speech about love, and Socrates goes last. So he's like, okay, I've got the last word here. So Socrates says, the highest form of love is procreative. And by the way, he doesn't mean anything about human reproduction, babies, or anything like that. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about love that wants to reproduce in another person the love of goodness. Love seeks always what's best for the other person, which is virtue. So this idea that you want to be a virtuous person, you want to pursue the good, and you want to try to inculcate that in someone else. You want to help the other person pursue virtue, pursue good, because that's best for them. That is real love, according to Socrates. So, at any rate, that's a good example. This is an example where Socrates tries to do this for someone else. And so, James Mumford says, we should seek brutal friends who refuse to accept us as we are, because friends challenge and coax. They don't just help us to realize our pre-established goals. They question whether our goals are the right ones in the first place. Now, a lot of people, and another reason, by the way, that people don't want to necessarily do this for other people, that's kind of ingrained in the culture, I think a lot of it has to do with just the idea of freedom. In the United States, freedom is a really paramount concern. People they respect the freedom of others. They don't want anybody to trample on their own freedom. They don't want to coerce anyone. And they don't want to be coerced, right? So that's something that's kind of in our minds. We don't want to impose on the other because we believe in freedom. So we don't want to be like a state of tyranny, right, where citizens tell other people how to live even though they don't necessarily agree with it. That's something that we've got to kind of fight against too, because if we truly believe that the gospel is true, if we truly believe that Christ is God and that what he's teaching us is in accord with reality, it's what's good for us. He created us. All things were created through him, the Bible says. So he's got the owner's manual. He knows how this is supposed to work. But here's the other thing, too, with the good can never be coerced. And in the article, Mumford uses the example of a guy who wasn't spending enough time with his family. And maybe he was like that, too, as he was a workaholic in his past. And so imagine if a father just tells his kids that he loves them, but he never actually spends time with them, the currency of attention, he never spends that on them. And then his wife can't stand it anymore. And so she kind of ties him up and forces him to be in the same room as his kids. Well, yeah, you might be seeing your kids all the time if you're tied to the kitchen wall, but that's not right either, because that's not freely chosen. That is being imposed from the outside. And the kids are going to figure that out. He's not doing this freely, and he doesn't have the good himself. It's being imposed from the outside. And so that's true with the faith too, because the faith can never be imposed. Pope Benedict said it's always proposed, never imposed. And in the same way, we have to choose this for ourselves. Nobody can act virtuously for us on our behalf. We've got to do it. We've got to live it out. And then we can be much more credible witnesses when we want to share this goodness with other people. So we ourselves have received it from God. We're not lording it over people. This is a gift that's been given it to us. We're associates. Augustine talked about us being associates in goodness that's outside of both of us. You and your friend. God is the source of all goodness. Your friend's good lies with God as well as your own. So any true friendship means bringing the other person to God. That's where they can find the true good, not coercively, pointing them in the right direction. And that's a great art form. It's difficult to do this. And he just closes this article. I'll leave you with this. It's a great piece, but he again goes back to this case of Emma and Mr. Knightley in Jane Austen's story, how he rebukes Emma to her betterment and to the betterment of their friendship. It actually makes them better and deeper friends because he called her on it when she was wrong. And this is what he says. This is what Mumford says. I'm just going to quote him because it's a powerful quote. He says, "I know in my own case that I may tell myself the reason I don't confront my friends is because I fear being paternalistic. I fear being interfering. I fear being presumptuous. But usually the real reason I don't confront my friends is because my fear of rejection is greater than my concern for their good. Their flourishing is not ultimately as important to me as our friendship, and our friendship is thus not oriented to the good that is beyond us." End of quote. Wow, that is a powerful point. We can't let the friendship itself become an idol. We've got to do what's good for the other person, what's best for the other person. That's what our faith teaches us. It's what Christ did. That's the example of the cross.